Hi, we are continuing our read of A to Z's of horror. Today, we are doing G for Grimm Tales. Sidebar. The truth is that the fears of childhood and the fears of adulthood are basically the same at bottom. It's just that your perceptions of them change as you get older. David Cronenberg. The first such stories I read inevitably were fairy tales. I had several volumes as a kid and found in their darkest corners images and ideas I never tired of examining. Back and back I'd go to keep company with cannibal witches and lunatic queens, dragons and phantoms, and malignant spirits, passing over the simpery stuff, kissing and orphans and kissing, to get to the business of the wild wood. Clive Barker. There are two versions of childhood: the advertiser's childhood of cute remarks and freckles and wide eyes full of wonder. And then there's another, more vicious scenario, the perverse childhood of sudden violence and scary toys and eyes full of blankness. Fairy tales abound in images of horror and dark fantasy: Snow White choking to death on an apple, a cannibal witch keeping Hansel and Gretel like animals in a cage to fatten them up for the oven, and Tom Thumb being eaten alive. Once upon a time, long, long ago, there lived a rich man who had two children. His little boy was given him by his first wife, who died when the boy was born. So the man married again and had a little girl born by him, his second wife. And when she looked at her own daughter and then looked at the little boy, it pierced her heart to think that he would always stand in the way of her own child. This evil took possession of her more and more and made her behave very unkindly to the boy. She would drive him to a place with her duffings and buffetings. The poor child went about in fear. If you think you went into a shopping mall and asked 100 people what their perception of fairy tale was, says Tim Burton, director of Edward Scissorhands, 1990, it would be like a children's story. Then if you showed them some of Grimm's fairy tales, they might be a little horrified to see it's probably worse than most of the Friday the 13th movies. Things aren't always as simple or what they seem. And I think that's what I like about the fairy tale form, that it's not cut and dried. It's open to interpretation. Side quote. He'd always been a solitary child, as much as through choice as circumstance, happiest when he could unshackle his imagination and let it wander into a world more pungent and more remote than the one he knew, a world whose secrets were carried to his nostrils by winds mysteriously warm in a chill of December, whose creatures paid him homage on certain nights at the foot of his bed, and whose peoples he conspired with in sleep. From Weave World by Clive Barker. And I have two pictures. Lawrence Harvey and Carl Bone create the wonderful world of the Brothers Grimms, and above the Brothers Grimm. And so it came to pass one day when the boy came back from school, the wife said to him, "My child, will you have an apple?" But she gave him a wicked look because the evil thought had come into her head that she would kill him. "Come with me," she said, and she shifted the lid of the great big chest where she kept the apples. "Take one for yourself," she said, and she smiled at the boy. So the boy bent over the chest, and as he did so, the evil spirit urged her and crashed down with the lid, and off went the little boy's head. The Juniper Tree is an extraordinarily violent story, says Hannah Castien, reader in modern languages at London University. It is therefore somewhat surprising that it formed the nucleus of a storybook for children, a famous collection of fairy tales which the Brothers Grimm collected in the early 19th century. The brothers shared with their fellow romantics a predilection for violence, I suppose, and a deep interest in the dark-minded side of the mind, which finds such strong expression in these tales. Many of the folk legends that the Grimm brothers went on to collect erupt into similar images of intense horror. Clearly, when the Grimm brothers collected their tales, continues Hannah Castien, what they found were stories that were at times pretty crude. They were pretty prudish about the sexual aspects of this and about bodily functions, and they almost eliminated them entirely. However, they were less prudish about the violent aspects. They felt that children could take these. Children were not easily frightened. They would not be damaged by this violence at all. The woman was overwhelmed with fear at the thought of what she had done. "No one must know I have killed him," she thought, "so I will make him into puddings." So she took the little boy and cut him up and made him into puddings and put him in the pot. But his little sister stood on, looking on, and wept, and her tears fell into the pot so that there was no need of salt. When the husband came home, the wife gave him a large dish of black pudding and told him that his son had gone away into the country. The father was very sad that his son had gone away and had not said goodbye, but he went on with his dinner. He asked his wife for more pudding and threw the bones under the table. Side. These macabre exercises are pure escapism, and to claim they harm children is the veriest nonsense. For them, they are simply fairy tales, no grimmer than the grim their grandmothers used to read them at bedtales. Vincent Price. Quote, the fascination of the horror film is perhaps because it is make-believe. Most people like to pretend that there is something just beyond the door. It transports the audience to another world, a world of fantasy and of imagination, a world inhabited by the characters of Hans Andersen and the Brothers Grimm. The horror film is concocted more or less from the folk tales of every country. When I am asked if these films are harmful to children, my answer is always the same. Do Grimm's fairy tales do any harm to children? I've never heard of fairy tale books being used in evidence in a juvenile delinquency case. Horace Karloff. And then we have a picture featuring the films of Tim Burton all the way up to 1996, so that's pretty out of date. And this illustration, Alfred Zimmerman's illustration of Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. A little picture of Nightmare Before Christmas, but we all know that. Those are some creepy looking dwarves. When I was 6 years old, I read The Princess and the Goblin, and the images from that fairy story have never left me since, recalls award-winning horror novelist Ramsey Campbell. One in particular was a palace guard seeing a figure whose head was as round as a ball and with a face that one might have carved on a pumpkin, but a head twice the size it ought to have been for the body. Now, these things stayed with me, particularly in the dark, and peopled my bedroom for nights after I'd read them. It just set my imagination off, and probably that's where I come from as a writer ever since. But for Ramsey Campbell, it was not just his childhood reading that influenced him as a writer, but also the peculiarities of his early family life. Very shortly after I was born, or when I was no more than a year old, I suppose, my parents became estranged. And before I was more than 3 or 4 years old, my parents lived almost totally apart in the same small house, 3 bedrooms, 2 rooms downstairs. Because I had to side with one parent or the other, I stayed with my mother. My father became a totally unseen presence in the same house. I suppose that there was a sense in which all that was going on in the house became magnified. I mean, not merely the footsteps coming upstairs in the dark, but also my bedroom became a kind of place of, if not exactly terror, then certainly fears of the corners. When I read my story, The Chimney, to an audience, then I realized that clearly what I was writing about was the terror of my father coming into my room. Indeed, the story actually contains the line that this terrible thing which invades this young chap's childhood was in some sense his father. It's kind of a projection of his fears about his father, which makes this figure monstrous. Although the little boy was cooked and eaten, he didn't die. His sister buried his bones under the juniper tree, and he came back to life as a little bird. But he was determined to have revenge upon his wicked stepmother. He picked up a huge millstone in his beak and flew with the cottage, singing, "My mother killed me, my father ate me. Kiwit, what a fine bird I am." Horror stories and fairy tales are united by a dark core. They construct fearful, menacing worlds which we are drawn into as a way of exploring our own private terrors. When I read a fairy tale nowadays, I don't really understand it, admits Tim Burton. But you do understand on an emotional, visceral level. I think that it was the whole purpose of those things, to help children to understand the horrors and complexities of life. Upon hearing this song, the woman fell to the floor in fear and trouble, and then she sprang up, her hair standing out from her head like flames of fire, and ran out the cottage. And she crossed the threshold, crash. The bird threw the millstone down on her head, and she was crushed to death. There was a huge flame and a great ball of smoke, and there, on exactly the same spot, appeared the little boy. Okay, side quote. The shadows moved things. The mesh of the fire guard fluttered, enlarged on the wall, sometimes at the edge of sleep. It became a swaying web, and its spinner came sidling down from a corner on the ceiling. The room grew in the dark, sounds outside, footsteps and laughter, dogs encouraging each other to bark, only emphasized the size of my trap of darkness, how distant everything else was. From The Chimney by Ramsey Campbell. Quote, but for want of a typewriter, Ramsey Campbell might well have emerged at birth with an essay on the darker side of the life of the womb. For Ramsey possesses a vision of the world and all it contains. Unlike any other, he finds shadows and unerring skill and picks out from scenes and situations that most of us would find quite remarkable. Pieces of darkness embedded there like glass shards in a car wreck victim. Clive Barker. Quote, we have all been brought up with these mini horror stories from nursery rhymes and Brothers Grimm, so what I am doing is no different. I'm not doing anything new. It's just more graphic these days. James Heather. The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, USA, Germany, 1962, director Henry Levin with Lawrence Harvey, Carl Baum, Claire Bloom, Walter Slezak, Barbara Eden, Oscar Homolka, George Powell, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, color. Co-scripted by Charles Beaumont and based on Die Brüder Grimm by Dr. Hermann Gerster, this features 3 fairy stories within the framework of the rise to fame of Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, Harvey and Baum, respectively. Russ Tamblyn stars in The Dancing Princess, the tale of a princess who dances all night with the gypsies. Harvey plays a cobbler whose wooden elves come to life, courtesy of producer Powell's Puppet Tunes, on Christmas Eve in The Cobbler and the Elves. And Terry Thomas and Buddy Hackett are forced to battle a superb stop-motion dragon, animated by Jim Danforth, in The Singing Bone. In the end, the sick Wilhelm is visited by all the characters who will write about fairies, elves, Snow White, and Tom Thumb, Tamblyn recreating his role from the 1958 film. With Yvette Mimieux, Jim Backus, Ian Wolfe, and Beulah Bondi, filmed in Cinescope. When we look at a number of fairy tales, we can observe certain patterns of plot, as Hannah Castian explains. One of the simplest patterns is that a hostile force intrudes into an established simple order of things. For example, the family unit intruded upon by the stepmother. That basic pattern is included in modern horror fiction. An example would be Stephen King's It, where a small community is invaded by a very powerful and dangerous force which threatens the whole town. A group of weaker individuals manage to conquer and overpower this force. They do it by using the virtues of the child in the fairy tale, a bit of cunning, a lot of courage, and an innate goodness which is victorious at the end. The juniper tree is such an empowering story. The boy does come back to avenge himself. He finds strength to defeat the intruder mother, and he actually kills her. So that at the end of the story, it's not only the who's empowered, but the rest of the family. We have restored harmony, and we have a stronger child at the end of it. Quote, he did not even like opening the door to flick on the light because he always had the idea, this was so exquisitely stupid he didn't dare tell anyone, that while he was feeling for the light switch, some horrible clawed paw would settle lightly over his wrist and jerk him down into the darkness that smelled of dirt and wet and dim rotted vegetables. From It by Stephen King. Quote, I don't remember a time that I wasn't genuinely interested in horror in some form or another. It was always the grisly bits of fairy tales that I was interested in. I've always liked fantastical literature of some kind, and I've always liked the darker aspects of that. Clive Barker. And above right, Warwick Gobble's illustration of the juniper tree in the fairy book. And that is G for Grimm Tales. When I was a kid, I read a lot of Hans Christian Andersen because The Little Mermaid was my favorite Disney movie. And being the person that I am, I automatically needed to read like everything about it. So I ended up reading the original Tale of Little Mermaid when I was like 8 or something like that. Ooh, it is very different. But it is an interesting story still. I mean, the older I get, the more I understand about it. But yeah, it was pretty shocking to me as a kid. So next week is H for Harlequinade. And we're going to talk about clowns. Woo, 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 woo. So thank you for reading with me. I will see you next week. Bye.